Hi, I'm Len McDonald, and this is episode 10 of the Week 45 podcast. Think I'll go out to Alberta. The weather's good there in the fall. Got some friends that I could go to working for. Still, I wish you'd change your mind if I asked you one more time. But we've been through this 100 times or more. 4 strong winds that blow lonely, 7 seas that run high. All those things that don't change, come what may. For the good times are all gone, and I'm bound for moving on. I look for you if I'm ever back this way. Well, Pete, we're on the road again.
One more trip here, and we're tying up season 1 of the Week 45 podcast.
Right on. Season 1 will be in the
rearview mirror.
Yes, a good way of putting it. When we last left off, we had stayed in Swift Current, Alberta, and that was our leaving off point on September 6th, 2018. And Pete, as I recall, that was one of the longest days that we traveled in any of our travels. It was close to 1,400 kilometers. We left early in the morning, 7 o'clock from Swift Current, and we went through Regina. And then we went up started up into northern Ontario, into Kenora, and we arrived very late at night at Ignace. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't the easiest day of our travels.
No, you tend to get in a groove on these big road trips, and 1,000-kilometer day ends up being kind of the norm, and you sort of don't notice it going by. But when you start tacking on 1,200, 1,300, 1,400, it's almost exponential. You start to really feel it by that time.
And once you're getting into northern Ontario, of course, it's not the smooth, easy, traveling 130 through Arizona. Mm-hmm. It's hard driving. There's a lot of truck traffic. Mm-hmm. The roads are not in great shape. It's dark at night, and you're kind of at the end of a long day. So I recall that was not an easy day at all.
No, it was a bit of a slog, that's for sure.
And regardless, we did it, and the next morning we get up bright and early and left Ignace. We went through Thunder Bay and arrived at 6:30 that evening in Sault Ste. Marie. And Pete, you had mentioned to me that you had a connection of a place to stay in Sault Ste. Marie.
Yeah, that's right. My good buddy Ryan Hawes, his wife Jessica, her parents live in Sault Ste. Marie. That's where she's from. Mike and Marianne Sirachi had us there for dinner, and it was an amazing Italian feast, second to none. I mean, God, I still remember that. That was probably one of the best meals of the whole trip.
I would say, hands down, it was the best meal of the entire trip. And I remember the, what was that platter with the meats and the cheese?
Charcuterie.
Charcuterie. It was the most amazing charcuterie tray I'd ever seen. And if that's all we had eaten, I would have been perfectly fine. But then they're Italian, correct, Pete?
Yeah.
And this amazing, amazing meal. It was just fantastic. And they were two of arguably the nicest people I've ever met. They treated us like royalty.
They're great. They're great people.
Yeah. You know, after a tough day the day before, that was a real treat to be in somebody's home and be treated warmly and to have a nice bed and a great meal and a glass of wine. And I think she had some phenomenal desserts and stuff. It was just, I didn't want to leave Sault Ste. Marie.
Yeah, yeah.
The next morning we left Sault Ste. Marie and we made our way down to through Sudbury. And then we headed down to Burlington, Ontario. The reason for Burlington was twofold. You had some friends in Hamilton, and I had friends in Burlington, Kathy McDonald and Constant Wrigley Thomas. So we pulled into Burlington at supper time, and that's where we stayed for the next couple of days. We hung out there for a few days. Did you go and visit your...
Yeah, I visited a friend in Hamilton, and we just kind of stuck around that area, I think, for probably 2 days.
Yeah. I recall Connie brought her mother over to Kathy's, and I think we did a little impromptu concert.
Yeah.
Or was it both of us, or was it just me? Do you remember doing that?
No, I remember going to a different house in Burlington and showing up and pulling out the guitars and playing.
I love the ocean, I'm from Nova Scotia, and summer's in the air, and I'm heading to the cabin where crazy things happen when my friends meet me there. Rush hour ain't pretty, the heat in the city, it can get you down sometime, but I'm seeking relief with my friend Alex Keith and a great big bottle of wine. Ranting and raving, we're misbehaving, but that's alright now and then. Getting tight, having fun, we ain't hurting anyone. Oceanside again. It was actually kind of nice to have a down day. You know, we put in a lot of tough miles, and just before the last run to Nova Scotia, just to have that time to kind of chill out and take it easy. So
yeah, when you're keeping up that kind of pace, it's nice to have a day or two to kind of break it up. We did some stretches where there were multiple days in a row where it was 1,000 kilometers, 1,200 kilometers, 1,100 kilometers, and just day after day after day. So yeah, it was nice to stick a little mini vacation in the middle of that.
Yeah, it was a great time, and I thank Kathy for putting up with us for a couple of nights.
Yeah.
It was great. September 11th, we left Burlington, made our way up through Kingston. Oh, yes, that was a long day because we didn't get on the road till late in the morning. And when that happens, it translates on the far end because we didn't get into Rivière-du-Loup till 11:30 at night.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
That was, and again, that was a pretty big day.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you're on the 401 and you're just motoring along, there's nothing on that particular stretch that was particularly memorable to me, other than that we were getting closer to home.
Yeah.
Final day, September 12th, we left Rivière-du-Loup in the morning, and we arrived back in Antigonish 5:45 for a grand total of 6,784 kilometers. It's a big country, Pete.
It's extremely big, yes.
So that kind of wraps up the 4 big trips that Pete and I took over a period of 3 or 4 years. Learned a lot, drove a lot, ate a lot, had a lot of really cool experiences. But Pete, before we end season 1, I know that back in 2020, you had the opportunity to drive across Canada from east to west going solo. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of just give us a bit of a background on how that came about and your views now of Canada, having sort of gone across the country both ways.
Yeah, so a bit of backstory there. In 2019 and early 2020, I was performing on cruise ships down in the Caribbean. And just before the pandemic hit in March of 2020, I was between Jamaica and Mexico in the middle of the sea, and we got the word that the whole industry was shutting down and that we were going to have an option to either stay on the ship, go back out to sea without passengers and wait it out, or leave immediately. And I had about 2 or 3 days to kind of make the decision because things were still developing. And I remember calling back home and talking to you and Mom and sort of asking your opinion on what you thought, because at that point the pandemic wasn't 100% understood. The NBA had just shut down its season. That was like the big thing that raised my eyebrows, but it was still very, very early. So I gave you guys a call. And
yes, and I remember I was up in northern Quebec at the time, and we were just at the point where we were going to be shut down for the balance of the year. So, we knew things were fairly serious. And I remember when you called, and I know my reaction was instantaneous, and I just said, get off that ship. I mean, that's the last place you'd want to be with an outbreak of anything, and especially something we didn't really know about.
Yeah. So I remember performing my last show on the ship. It was a wild night, and the crowd had a great time, and it was very celebratory. And then we made our way back to Miami and dropped all the passengers off. And in the meantime, I contacted my agent and got him to arrange me a flight, which was very stressful and very hard to do. Already the airports were becoming chaotic, and the flight schedules were starting to get really touch and go. So there were a lot of nerves there and a lot of uncertainty. And anyway, I made my way off the ship, and I think it ended up being a 30 to 40 hour trip home from Miami to Antigonish due to having to take buses and stay at hotels overnight and flight delays and all kinds of stuff. It was a long trip. I ended up back in Antigonish, let's say 48 hours later, and quarantining in my Aunt Eleanor's cottage out in Bayfield.
Pete, do you roughly have an idea what the date was when you got back into Canada?
I think it was March 16th, if I remember correctly.
Okay, because I left the north on the 29th of March and came home and did my first quarantine, and you were quarantining out at Elner's.
Yeah.
And I know that after we both got out of quarantine, and it was all new to us, to everybody, right? That I think the remaining few months that you were around, that you and I spent a lot of time together and did a lot of hiking and walking and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. We got a lot of hikes in, had a lot of good meals. And come late summer, it was sort of becoming apparent that for me, playing music live, which was my bread and butter, was not returning anytime soon. And I was starting to get restless after all of this downtime. And I had moved into another cottage that my relatives owned, my Aunt Denise and Mike, and I had been staying there for about 3 months. And getting towards the end of July, I just decided it was time to do something. And because there were no gigs, I thought, in order to get myself moving and doing something, I had an opportunity to go out west and return to British Columbia and work on an organic farm. That was my idea at that time, just to do something different. So I thought, I'm going to get in the car by myself. I'm going to do a very low-key drive across the country because, of course, at this time, nobody was really supposed to travel for any reasons that weren't deemed essential. But I figured I would do it by myself. I put together camping gear, and I was going to avoid all the major cities and kind of do my own version of a solo cross-country trip in the early stages of a pandemic. So
around the time that you were deciding to do your solo trip, I had decided that I was going to head back up north for a second year. And it was just such a peculiar time because we really hadn't gotten into the really heavy duty part of the pandemic. It was just starting to ramp up and nobody quite knew what to do. And I thought, well, I might as well be up north teaching. And you thought I might as well be out west rather than sitting around twiddling my fingers.
Yeah, it's better to be doing something and keeping yourself in motion somehow.
Yeah.
So that was the inspiration to kind of take that trip by myself across Canada. So I remember I planned it out and I packed up the car and headed out on my own, like the first time after all these trips that we had done together, the 3 trips across the United States and the 1 trip across Canada. Now I was going to do a solo trip. So that was the beginning. And I documented it along the way. And the first stop on my solo trip was Rivière-du-Loup. And I did that trip in a single day.
Actually, upon reflection, Pete, considering the drives that we had done before, Rivière-du-Loup would be like going to Glasgow from here. A big day is going to Ottawa from Antigonish in one day.
Yeah.
So,
but to start out a trip,
yes,
when you haven't been driving very far, and
yeah.
So afterwards, I made my way down the St. Lawrence, and I remember that being a very beautiful drive. It was prime time. It was summer, It was the end of July. Everything was warm and beautiful, and the weather was nice, and getting down closer to Montreal.
It's interesting, that particular stretch of Highway the 20 that goes all the way, from Rivière-du-Loup right down to Montreal and actually beyond a little bit. It's one of the few multi-lane highways that's actually a nice drive. Most of the 4-lane stuff that we drove over time, I mean, until you get off the road and into a city or a town, it's pretty mundane, but that's a spectacular drive.
It's just beautiful, and there's some small mountain ranges along
Yes,
there too,
yes.
and it's very pretty. I agree. A lot of the highways that we drove on were pretty utilitarian and point A to point B, kind of cut right through the middle of nowhere. And
Well, it'd be very much like here, somebody arriving in Nova Scotia and hearing about all this fantastic scenery and driving from Amherst to Cape Breton on the Trans-Canada. Well, you might as well be in northern Maine or in northern Ontario. I mean, there's nothing to see.
it's true. That wouldn't be the prime choice for highways if you wanted to get the real feel of Nova Scotia. You want to take the scenic route, but
Yeah, and I think one thing that, and you've learned at an early age, it took me a lot longer to realize this because more often than not, when I was traveling in the earlier days, it was A to B, and just getting there was the key thing.
yeah.
But as I get older and I realize, like, wow, if you can just take a different route, the road not taken, like, if I was coming across the border in Amherst and coming here, I'd go along the Northumberland shore. I mean,
Sure.
it's magnificent.
It is.
So,
I remember asking some of my friends for tips and ideas and things that I might be able to stop and see along the way, and that kind of dictated my own route across Canada here, in addition to possibly staying with a few friends in their backyard and things like that. Mind you, at this time, like I said, travel was strictly for essential purposes only. And it was really, really frowned upon to be mingling with people and hanging out and being in people's houses. I mean, that was the early days of the pandemic. Fear was at an all-time high, uncertainty. So my next stop was Montreal, and I did go into the city, and I spent the evening with my sister Ellie and her boyfriend Eric and my niece Ivory. And I didn't post anything about that part, but we went for a hike the next day just outside of Montreal.
Right.
And that I did post because it was acceptable to do that kind of thing. I even wrote that I had gone for a hike with them, but not that I had stayed the evening before.
yeah.
So after that, the route that I took started to differ a little bit from the one that we took on the way back. Instead of going the southern route, which is along Lake Ontario through Kingston and
Toronto and
Toronto,
Yeah.
I went the northern route starting in Ottawa and taking
I think it's the 17.
the 17 highway, which goes through
North Bay and
Sudbury and
right.
places like that. So I remember I was playing it by ear this whole time. My idea originally was to camp as many places as I could. I had a car full of camping gear, but by the time I got going after our hike in Montreal, it was starting to get towards supper time, and the thought of driving another 5 hours and then finding a campground and then setting up, it started to become apparent that a hotel would be a better idea that night. And as it turned out, that was the case a couple times along the trip when I'd put in these long days. The last thing you want to do is find a campground that's handy to the highway and then set up your tent and cook yourself a meal. You just want to get off the road and be done with it.
If I can digress here, because it reminds me of a story that I've written about, that you and we were going somewhere. It doesn't matter. We may have been going to a concert in Ontario, but I remember we had packed a tent and we left our place on Viewville Street, and our first night was in the Fundy National Park. And we got there, and it was like, again, it was dark. It was the evening, and this whole trip was going to be tenting. We were going to try to keep the costs down and do our own thing and cook our own meals. And I remember when we got there, it was pitch dark, trying to set up the tent. We realized that the tent poles were back home, and we ended up staying in the most expensive bed and breakfast like that I've ever been in my entire life, and and had a restaurant meal. And so that whole notion of doing it on the cheap went right out the window on day one. And I know the next day we had to go and actually buy another small 2-man tent.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress.
Yeah. So there's some things you learn about the pacing of a trip and your expectations versus reality. And I think if I were to do that again with the intention of camping, it would be a much longer trip and much shorter driving days and have it planned out a little better.
Live and learn.
Live and learn. So in my case, I got up from that hotel just outside of Ottawa and started heading west through Sudbury. And I remember sending a message to a friend of mine. I knew his family lived somewhere close to Sault Ste. Marie along the shores of Lake Huron. And I did get in touch with him, and he said, I'm here right now. Actually, I'm visiting my parents. Do you want to come and pitch your tent in the backyard, and we'll have a meal and the whole bit? So I remember that leg of the journey. It was a beautiful day, stopping, pulling out my Coleman stove at a little rest stop and making a bacon and eggs meal and hopping back in and just driving forever. I remember also that I hadn't turned the radio on once, and I didn't for the whole trip. This whole trip for me was all about taking time to think and to reflect. It was just open windows, my own thoughts, the road going by. That was the trip. So my friend got in touch with me and told me to come by. And they were in a place called Huron Shores, which I think is about an hour and a half southeast of Sault Ste. Marie. And I showed up, and they had this beautiful old farm. It was the property that he had grown up on. His parents still lived there. His dad was still doing the farm work. And it seemed like it was kind of another time. It was a beautiful old farmhouse and farmland. And they invited me on, and I pitched my tent. It was evening by the time I got there. The mosquitoes were unbelievably bad. They were probably the worst I had ever experienced. I had bought this little thing called a Thermacell at Canadian Tire, and it has this little cartridge that goes in, and it heats up an element and creates this 2-meter bubble of protection. And I remember for the half hour that thing was warming up, it was absolute pure hell. And then it was bearable. So I pitched my tent, got to bed, and we woke up, and Scott's parents had made a full farm breakfast for us. We ate outside, socially distanced, appropriate for the times. And then I set up my live broadcasting equipment, and we did a little concert for everybody on Facebook.
I remember tuning into that. It was amazing. He's a good musician, right?
Scott's a great musician.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was a nice little pit stop. And that night, too, I forgot that the Milky Way was out. And that's another one of those places that's quite removed from any major light pollution. So there were some incredible night skies, and I got some pretty neat shots of that. I'm sure I'll include one or two in the podcast video here. So I continued on, and that next day I remember going up the shore of Lake Superior, and it was busy. All the campgrounds were completely booked. Even though it was early days of the pandemic, that might have been a reason that they were even more busy than normal, because I tried to get a campsite and I couldn't find one the whole northern shore of Lake Superior, which is a long drive. So I ended up staying at some motels along the way, but I did get to stop and see some petroglyphs and go for a swim in Lake Superior and do some hiking on my own. And I remember stopping just before you leave Lake Superior and continue west and north. I got a call from Dad, and he asked if I could take part in one of his Facebook Live performances. So I pulled over on the side of the road, coming up into these mountainous areas just off of Lake Superior. And I remember I was looking back at the lake, and I set up my camera on a fence and basically tuned in and played some songs right there as a little break.
Legend lives on from the Chippewa down of the big lake they call Kitchigumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. With a load of iron ore 26,000 tons more than the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed a me. That good ship and true was a bone to be chewed when the gales of November came early. Yeah, that was awesome. I remember that night, and it was one of my pillow talk sessions, and the people who were tuned in were quite taken with it. And it's amazing, again, you think about technology, the fact that we could do any of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
To be able to do a live show, and people anywhere in the world could listen to it, and you're doing it remotely. It's fascinating.
It's really quite something. And I'll say that during the pandemic, coming off of the cruise ship where that was such a stimulating time where I was performing 6 nights a week in front of a live crowd and being in this cottage by myself and just having nothing, just radio silence all of a sudden, having that outlet to do those live streaming concerts, which again, it seems like it was ages ago now, but it was only 2 years ago. And at that time, live streaming was a new thing. It was very fresh. And I remember doing one every week. I did 10 of them in a row during the pandemic. Being able to continue to do them on the road was a real lifeline to me to just keep connected with people and feel like, although I was totally on my own, I still was amongst friends and had some human connection of some kind.
And I think those shows were a lifeline for other people too, especially people who felt housebound, who were housebound and had no social life at all. That these live stream concerts, I mean, I ended up doing over 60 of them. I underestimated how important they were, and it certainly was not because of my singing or guitar playing, but just the connectivity and being able to chat back and forth with people on the screen and stuff. So you being able to kind of tune in was wonderful. It was good for you and it was good for us.
Pretty neat to be able to do that in the middle of nowhere and just pull off the highway and kind of make it happen.
Yeah.
So when I got to Thunder Bay, you have the option to go the northern route to Kenora, which is what most people do. That's kind of considered the main highway.
Right.
And in fact, it's the shorter route on paper. But I remember that being kind of my least favorite portion of the trip, being stuck behind transfer trucks, endless, monotonous forests, and just nothing to look at except the back license plate of a giant 18-wheeler for 10 hours plus. So I decided to go the southern route, which took you through Quetico Provincial Park, which, as it turns out, is a beautiful drive, perfect highway, no cars. It was a completely different experience. And because I wasn't in any kind of a hurry at all, the extra hour and a half, 2 hours that it took was not even an issue. And in fact, it may have ended up actually being the same if you factor in the traffic and how slow you're going on the other roads. So I had a really relaxing drive. And I remember as I approached Kenora, the skies started to get very stormy looking, and I could see lightning in the distance and quite a lot of it. And by the time I had actually reached the city of Kenora, it had become this incredible storm and torrential rain hitting my windshield. And it was all I could do to find the motel that I was going to stay at. And when I finally parked, it was raining so hard that the minute you opened your door, you're 100% soaked. You just had to accept that until you got in the hotel room, you're going to be wet.
Yes, I recall being in some of those, Pete, in my travels over the years, especially on the prairies. When you get a prairie storm is like no other.
Yeah.
And I know traveling through Saskatchewan or Alberta, this incredible thunder and lightning and driving rain, and vehicles just literally had to pull off the side of the road. The wipers wouldn't move quickly enough. It was dangerous.
Yes. Yeah, it gets to that point.
Yep.
Fortunately, that was at the end of my drive that day, so I pulled into town and got myself into a hotel room and just looked out the window and went, wow, like I'm glad I was close to my destination when that happened.
Were you able to get a picture of that, Pete?
Well, actually, it was one of these short-lasting downpours, and in about a half hour, an hour, it was gone. So I wandered down to a marina, which was on one of the lakes. I believe it's Lake of the Woods that Kenora's on. And there was still a ton of lightning in the distance in the background. And everything was so calm because when a storm like that passes through, it generally is followed by a pocket of very still air and still weather. So I just had this opportunity to get this really cool shot of the lightning storm leaving Kenora with all of the boats sitting perfectly still at the dock.
Wonderful. So what was the next leg?
So the next leg of the trip was Kenora to Regina. And I will say I spent a few hours in Kenora before I left, and that next day was a beautiful sunny day. And Kenora on a sunny summer day is a really nice place. You can see why people want to be there. It epitomizes lake country living. All of the jet boats going by and the water skiers and the quaint downtown. It's really a nice place.
Yeah, Pete, sometimes it's just sort of the time of the day and the luck of the draw. You might arrive in a city late at night after a long day, and You just think it's the worst place in the world. And then the next time you come through, it's on a day like that. And all of a sudden you see it in a totally different light. So,
Yeah,
you shouldn't be too quick to judge any particular place until you've been there maybe a couple of times.
for sure. And judging a place on the time of year or the weather that day, you never really know. So it makes you try to imagine a place when it's in a better light, even if it wasn't that way.
Well, of course, because when we were coming west to east and we drove through Kenora and it was in the evening and it was, we're a long day and stuff like that. And like Kenora just like, get me out of here.
Yeah, but I actually didn't want to leave. I thought it was a really
Wow.
nice place, like especially that next
Yeah.
day. So then that gets you very quickly into the prairies and into the really straight, easy driving. And you can put a lot of miles on in a very short period of time, and it just goes by really quickly. I had this perception about the prairies that it was going to be unbearably boring just because there's nothing to see and it's very straight. But as it turns out, I found it one of the easiest parts of the drive and perhaps one of the most enjoyable for me because the skies are so big. First of all, there's some amazing sunsets there, and the light really is quite nice to look at. It offers some great photo opportunities. And the driving, even though it's straight, it's pleasant because it gives you time to look around and take things in a little bit because you're not so absolutely focused on the road and every single turn. So there was something about the prairies that I actually really liked. Sundown in the Paris of the prairies, wheat kings have all treasures buried, and all you hear are the rusty breezes pushing around the weather vane Jesus.
Yes, and again, going back to the previous point, it depends on the time of the year that you're traveling through the prairies. If it's there in the dead of winter or early spring, you're not going to see much, right?
Yeah.
But when you get into the summer and the fall and the crops are growing and you've got these fields of wheat and canola and all these things, it's really quite magnificent.
Just prior to getting my hotel in Regina that night, I made a detour into the Capel Valley, which was something that was recommended by someone that I do. And they said, you'll be really surprised when you get there because the landscape is so flat and so predictable for so long. And then you get to this place and all of a sudden out of nowhere, there's this huge gorge and it's very lush and very fertile. So it was getting late in the day, but I thought, okay, I got to do it anyway. I also noticed that there was a campground there, so I might be able to make that my final destination depending on how things went. So I remember getting off the highway and driving 35 kilometers inland through all these small, flat, grid-like little towns with wheat silos, and everything kind of looked the same. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, out of all these wheat fields and canola fields, there's this lush, green, fertile valley that you descend into. And right at the bottom of it was a campground. But when I got there, no one was home. And so I turned around and drove back to the highway and ended up getting a hotel in Regina that night. But
Wow. You've just given me a flashback, which is sort of similar in a way from walking the Camino. There's a stretch of the Camino, it's called the Meseta, and it's like the prairies. It's flat and it goes for maybe a couple of 100 kilometers. Mm-hmm. But there's something about the landscape, and sometimes when the landscape is very simple and flat, you just have a chance to think. And like you say, you don't have to really be grinding it, right?
Yeah.
And I remember going along, and all of a sudden, the very same type of thing. We went along, and all of a sudden, the land just dipped, and we went down into this valley, very short. And it's still my favorite place on the whole Camino. I remember we stayed there that night, and it was fabulous. The whole place was spectacular. It was beautiful, small little village. And I remember at the end of this particular day sitting around with people from 10 different countries.
wow.
And sitting outside. It was a sunny day. We're at a cafe. We're drinking beer, and I'm hearing all these languages and stuff. So sometimes it's worth the effort to go somewhere where you think it's going to be boring, but there's always a surprise on the road.
That's right. And finding a little oasis like the one you found in the Camino or the one I found here in Saskatchewan
Yeah.
was really neat. So the next day I woke up and I drove from Regina to Banff, and I remember that day being very, very, very hot summer day. The air conditioning in my car had stopped working a long time ago. And I had all the windows open and I was still sweating going 130 kilometers an hour down the road. It was hot. It was getting up into the mid 30s to high 30s. And I just remember looking around and looking at all the landscape, these endless canola fields and herds of cattle and the oil derricks going up and down and the heat just blasting down. And it was like a very strong image that whole day, the weather combined with the landscape. And I remember finally pulling into Banff, and it was equally hot there, but that was a point where I was going to stop and visit some friends of mine for a couple of days, which is what ended up happening.
And Banff, for those of you who've been there and know, is one of the most beautiful places in Canada.
It's incredible. And I kind of skipped over the point where you actually leave Calgary and you start seeing the foothills kind of looming up. You've been driving for, in some cases, days on these endless flat kind of landscapes. And then finally, you start to see these hills looming up. And within a couple hours, they get bigger and bigger and bigger and closer and closer and closer. And by the time you're actually into them, you're like, wow, I'm finally at the Rockies. And they announce themselves in the most definitive way.
It's spectacular. It's absolutely spectacular.
Yeah. And so once you start winding your way in through Canmore and you get to Banff, I mean, you're right at the foot of these immense monolithic mountains. And it's still one of my favorite places in Canada. I was happy to spend a few days there, which ended up being going to see like the Bow River Glacier and doing some hiking around Banff and doing some mountain biking. And we actually did another Facebook Live broadcast from my friend Ed and Carrie's living room with Cascade Mountain in the background. And so that was a nice stop for sure. And I also remember at that point, I had to get a cortisone shot in my shoulder because during the trip, without really realizing it, I guess I had been driving with my left arm in this position, so much that by the time I got there, I was starting to get this aching feeling in my arm. And by the time I pulled into Banff, I was in such pain that I couldn't put my shirt on. I couldn't do certain normal things. Like I had no mobility.
Could you lift a can of beer?
Well, with the other hand.
That's why the Lord gave us two hands, right, Pete?
Right. Needless to say, I needed some help because it was becoming pretty unmanageable. So in Banff, fortunately, they have an incredible healthcare system there that's geared around repairing injured people because there's such a large amount of extreme sports out there. And maybe it was because of the pandemic, but Ed tells me that this is the way that it goes at any given time. You're put through their system really quickly and really efficiently. And I remember in the space of 48 hours, I went to the emergency room, had a checkup, had an x-ray scheduled, had an ultrasound, went to a physio clinic, and had a cortisone shot, all in that period of time. And after that, I had relief, fortunately, and enabled me to get back on the road.
Lucky to live in Canada.
No doubt.
But
I will say, specifically lucky to be in Banff because that same process, I've had some friends recently who have been waiting weeks and weeks and weeks to get similar kinds of things done. So very lucky to be in Canada, but also lucky to be in the extreme sport capital of the country where they're used to seeing people with those kind of injuries. So I left Banff and headed for Vernon, BC, where my friend Ginny and her husband Peter are living right now. And I visited them for the evening once again, keeping appropriate social distancing, staying in their basement. And Vernon was another town that I had never been through, but that's kind of the northern section of the Okanagan. And it's incredibly beautiful, and you start to see why people like to live there as well. It's quite mountainous as well, but it's focused around lake living and agriculture, and the climate there is very dry. It's almost like a desert. They actually have rattlesnakes there and things like that. So that was my first glimpse of the upper part of the Okanagan.
I've been very fortunate over the years to travel through British Columbia. And, on their license plate says beautiful BC.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand why. I would go out on a limb and say that it might be the most beautiful province in Canada.
When I first went to BC, I thought it's pretty tough to drive through British Columbia and not think to yourself, they've really got it all out here. So that whole drive from Banff to Vernon through Revelstoke, Golden, Rogers Pass, all of it is just absolutely breathtaking. Even in the summer when you don't get that characteristic snow-capped mountain kind of look, it's got its own thing going on. And it's so grand and the scale is so big. It has flat desert, snow-capped mountains, incredible beaches, pretty much everything that you'd want to see. So getting down to the Okanagan and seeing Vernon and driving through Kelowna on my way to Vancouver was a really nice part of the trip, just to see that section of the province.
And lots of beautiful fresh fruit and vegetables. I mean,
it's known for that down there.
Yeah, for sure.
So I left Vernon, went through Kelowna, and cut across on the 97C, which is a connector that takes you to the Coquihalla, which joins up right around Merritt, just south of Merritt. And that highway was beautiful twinned highway that just winds its way through these very iconic scrubland, desert kind of mountains with these black pines, and it's very captivating in its own way. And a very easy kind of nice drive, as I remembered that. And then you join up with the southern part of the Coquihalla, the number 5 highway, and you make your way down, and eventually it spits you out right around Hope. And then you're back on the main drag into North Vancouver, which is where I ended up staying with my cousin Colin for a day or two. And so that kind of marked the end of the proper trip. But there was one last part of this trip that I can't...
It ain't over till it's over.
Yeah, I can't leave out the last part of this trip. I ended up taking the Horseshoe Bay Ferry, which lands in Nanaimo. And by that time of day, it was getting late. It was pouring rain. It was kind of cold. It was after dinner. It was getting dark. And I still had an hour and a half drive down to Victoria. So I remember thinking that instead of bothering a friend or trying to find a campground, I'm going to get a hotel right downtown, get a good sleep, and reevaluate the next day and get in touch with everybody that I knew. So I got a hotel the Days Inn on the Gorge Road. And I got there late, checked in, didn't know much about the area.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Back in the 70s, I lived on the Gorge Road. And it's a beautiful, beautiful part of the city. Just spectacular. When I heard you were going to be staying on the Gorge, I thought, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. So apparently times have changed a bit because there's a...
Well, 50 years will do that, right?
Well, I guess so.
Yeah.
I guess so. So I got my room, parked the car right next to my door, and went to sleep. Sometime during the night, someone broke into the vehicle. I woke up the next day. I went outside. The back window was smashed out, and half of my things were gone, including my 1964 Harmony Sovereign acoustic guitar, a good portion of my camera equipment, and a few other things that were annoyingly difficult to replace. Fortunately, I had my really expensive stuff, like my camera, my laptop, a few other odds and ends in the hotel room with me, but I was just too tired to unpack. All the pricey stuff was way down underneath a bunch of camping gear, and it was parked right in front of the door with lights on it the whole night, so I thought, there's no way it's going to be an issue. There's a huge homeless problem in Vancouver and Victoria right now, and that area has become known for petty crime and theft for people who are desperate to get money for drugs and for different things like that. So it was an opportunity crime. It was pretty clear to me that whoever did it needed the quickest, most easily resellable things that they could grab. Unfortunately for me, that guitar was not easily replaceable, and it took me a couple weeks to wrap my head around that this is probably gone. So I had a little bit of a rocky start to my return to Victoria that trip, but also I had a lot of friends out there who kind of rallied around me and gave me a guitar and helped me out and helped me kind of get my mood back on track after that shaky start.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate after a long road trip to have it end like that, but that's life as we know it.
Yeah. And you don't read into it too much. Fortunately for me, I mean, it all ended up working out. But in that moment, that morning, I was certainly not in the best spirits.
Yeah. So, Pete, let's wrap up this last episode of Week 45 podcast. I'm particularly interested now that you've seen your country from coast to coast, going in both directions. Have your perceptions changed?
My perception of the country has certainly changed after traveling across it twice. There's a lot more to see than I thought that there was. I assumed that because the United States has so many people and so many cities and everything is packed together, not to mention that there's different climates down there that don't exist in Canada. I thought that I had the idea of what Canada was. It's basically woods, lakes, mosquitoes,
Prairies,
and of course mountains once you get far enough west. But after driving across it, I've realized that it's an immense, huge country that takes a long, long, long time to get across, and you really don't understand that until you've been able to do it once, or in my case, twice. It's also an incredibly beautiful country with some parts of it that I never would have thought would have inspired me to feel the way I felt when I drove across them, like the prairies and Lake Superior with its Cabot Trail-like drives that surround it. There's just so many little areas of the country that you never would think, wow, I should visit there. I should check this out and see it for myself. But now I would really encourage anybody to do that and get out in your own backyard and see this country, because it's really spectacular and is every bit as inspiring as anywhere that I drove in the United States in its own way.
A very good summary. And at the risk of offending my friends in Newfoundland, I want to chirp in by saying that Newfoundland is probably the most extraordinary and unique province in the country that I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been to Newfoundland on several occasions. And have you been there, Pete?
I've been there 3 times, yeah.
Right. If you ever have a chance to go to Newfoundland, certainly I've been on the East Coast and I've been on the West Coast of Newfoundland, and they're very different and they're very spectacular. But one of the things that I discovered about all of my travels, not just Canada, but I noticed it particularly in Newfoundland, at the end of it, take away the scenery, take away the mountains and the prairies and the lakes and rivers and streams, it still comes down to people.
Mm-hmm.
And Newfoundland has the most amazing people in this country. I'm completely convinced. Well, it was on this Monday morning and the day be calm and fine, a harbour grace excursion with the boys who had the time. And just before the sailor took the gangway from the pier, I saw some fella haul me wife aboard as a volunteer. Oh me, oh my, I heard me old wife cry. Oh me, oh my, I think I'm gonna die. Oh me, oh my, I heard me old wife say, I wish I'd never taken this excursion around the bay. Hey!
I don't think there's many people who would argue with you who have spent any time in Newfoundland or around Newfoundland people. It's certainly been my experience as well.
Well, Pete, that's the end of the road. I don't know about you, but it's been fun reminiscing and kind of going back and looking at the travels we had together. We had a lot of interesting things, and luckily, when I think about it, Pete, all those trips, all those miles we put on, like knock on wood, we never had an accident. We had a few car problems and stuff, but we were very, very fortunate in many, many ways.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing experience.
Yeah. It's not often that you get to do a trip like that with your dad or with your son or anything like that. But also, it's not that common to be able to have this kind of a way to reminisce about it and bring back those memories a couple of years later. I never thought that we'd be doing a podcast about these travels. So as much as you had documented it in your own way and I took my pictures, I thought that was pretty good. But now we've got to reopen the whole thing and dive back into the details and get the memories going again. So this was a nice way to give it a second life, all those trips.
Absolutely. As I said from the outset, there's the real trip and then there's the virtual trip. And I think the virtual trip is a lot easier on the wallet and a lot easier on the head. It's still great because, we're reliving something together.
Absolutely.
So that's it, folks. Season 1 we'll see what the reaction is from folks, and if all goes well, we would possibly tee up a season 2. I know I certainly have lots more stories about my travels in India, living and working in the Arctic, and walking across Spain. So there's endless numbers of stories that can be told. And if everything goes well, we'll try to set up a season 2. So we want to thank anybody who supported us in any way, and thank people who tuned in and enjoyed what we had to offer. Yeah, we're pretty lucky guys.
We are indeed. I had a great time doing this, and I hope everybody enjoyed listening.
Okay, folks, thanks, and stay well, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Take care, everybody.